ahead, Mary.
All right.
All right, everyone, we're gonna get started.
All right. So I'm excited to share this with you guys. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to start by telling you just a little bit about me to give you some background on where all this, comes from. I usually tell people that my interest in nutrition started with a science fair project when I was 16, but I was also exposed to nutrition from a very early age, me watching my mom cook in the kitchen. This is funny. In the Science Museum where I grew up, actually, Andrew Edwards also said that he remembers this exhibit as well. There used to be this food section and this exhibit where they had on the wall like all these different foods, and you took this little Scantron card and you filled out like what foods you would eat. And then you put the Scantron card like into the machine and it would give you a printout on how well you were doing in terms of your nutrition. So when I was like, I don't know, a little kid, like I got this one, pig out, like because kids like to eat like cake and all those sorts of things. But I remember like thinking about this and just being very curious about it and wanting to understand it all more. So I went on to do a PhD in nutritional sciences because I really wanted to think about these things deeply. But then I also wanted to apply the science more directly. And that's why I became a doctor. And one of my goals is to translate more nutrition science into clinical settings. So that's what today is all about. So this is data from a study of the burden of chronic disease in the United States, published in JAMA. And it shows you that the number one risk factor for death from chronic disease is diet, more so than anything else. Today, we're going to talk about the big topics: nutrition and blood pressure, nutrition and diabetes, and nutrition and high cholesterol. So let's start with blood pressure. And I have a question for you guys. So let's say you could only make one recommendation to your patients to lower their blood pressure. Which recommendation do you think is going to decrease their systolic blood pressure the most? Do you want to tell them to decrease their sodium to less than 1,500 milligrams per day? Do you want to tell them to increase their potassium intakes, adhere to the DASH diet, or eat 4 tablespoons of ground flaxseed daily? Okay, who's for sodium? Raise your hand.
No eat.
No, just the 4 options. Increasing potassium. DASH diet. 4 tablespoons of ground flaxseed. Okay. So interestingly, if you look at these systolic blood pressure reductions for each of these options, something no one's ever heard of apparently has the greatest effect. So this comes from this randomized controlled trial. It wasn't done too long ago, it lasts like 5 years, 110 people over 6 months. They put some of them on an arm of 4 tablespoons of ground flax seeds per day, the others on a control. It was actually double blind, impressively, because they hid the flax seeds in like muffins and things, which is creative and adds to the legitimacy of the result. And they showed that after those 6 months, blood pressure was significantly reduced, 15 systolic units and 7 diastolic units. As for why this actually happens and how this all works, what the researchers reported is that the systolic blood pressure decreases correlate with the levels of omega-3 fatty acids in the blood.
This is why we're talking about salmon.
Yes, we were talking about the Maryview salmon the other day and how great it is that we have access to so much salmon because it's so important. So in order to understand how omega-3 fatty acids do this, let's start by talking about what omega-3 fatty acids are. And in order to understand what omega-3 fatty acids are, I'd like to introduce you to something that I call the dietary fat family tree. So we are going to walk through how all the different dietary fats are related to one another. So the first branch point in the dietary fat family tree is your saturated fats versus your unsaturated fats. So of course, saturated are like butter and red meat and beef tallow and lard, all those sorts of things. Within your unsaturated fat group, you have another branch point, which is your monounsaturated fats, or your MUFAs, things like olive oil, avocados, and then your polyunsaturated fats and your PUFAs, also called PUFAs. So within the PUFAs, you have another branch point, which is your omega-6 fatty acids. That's what you get from all of the vegetable oils. So cottonseed oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, canola oil. And then on the other hand, you have your omega-3 fatty acids, but we're still not there yet. There's many different types of omega-3 fatty acids. So the type that we're talking about in flaxseed is called ALA, or alpha-linolenic acid. That's the type you can get from plants. That's the type your body can convert into EPA, which is the type you get when you eat that salmon over across the street. And then that our body can also convert into DHA, which is actually in plankton, which is what the salmon eat, and that's why they have so much EPA that we can eat. So for most of American history, people ate saturated fats. This is just how it was. And this didn't change until approximately 1888, when the first continuous mechanical screw press was invented. Because now, for the first time in human history, oil could be extracted from seeds en masse. And prior to that, that wasn't possible. This invention didn't just change, the food industry, it also changed us in fundamental ways in our biology, because vegetable oils suddenly became a dietary staple, as shown here. And the problem is that vegetable oils are very high in omega-6 fatty acids. For most of human history, people ate an equal ratio of omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. But with the introduction of vegetable oils into the diet, suddenly this ratio drastically shifted. And today we eat about 15 times more omega-6s than omega-3s. In order to understand why, I want you to think about every single cell inside your body. I think that omega-3s and omega-6s are possibly one of the best examples of how you literally are what you eat. So think about those cells, and particularly, I want you to think about the cell membrane. So as we all learned in high school biology, the cell membrane is made from the phospholipid bilayer, right? You guys all remember this probably. And the phospholipid bilayer is made from phospholipids, which have a phosphate head and 2 fatty acid tails. So what kind of fats are those fatty acid tails often made from? Well, our omega-3s and our omega-6s. And we know that the way it works is if you eat more omega-3s, you actually have more omega-3 fatty acids encircling every single cell inside your body. On the other hand, if you eat more omega-6s, you have more omega-6 fatty acids encircling every cell inside your body. The reason this is important is because omega-3s and omega-6s are precursors for prostaglandins, right, which are basically like inflammatory molecules and chemicals. Omega-6 fatty acids produce pro-inflammatory prostaglandins. They promote vasoconstriction. They promote platelet aggregation, things that sometimes we need, but in excess are problematic. On the other hand, omega-3 fatty acids promote anti-inflammatory prostaglandins, vasodilation, and anti-aggregation, so things that are generally pretty good. Now, I've already given away one thing. They promote vasodilation, so that's obviously going to help with blood pressure. But there's another explanation for why omega-3s do this, which I think is very fascinating and interesting. And it has to do with the actual chemical structure of omega-3 fatty acids. So omega-3s are sometimes called kinky fats because they're so unsaturated, there are all these kinks in the chemical molecule. This is in stark contrast to saturated fats, because saturated fats, of course, have a hydrogen at every spot on the carbon. So you have these long chains, which then can arrange themselves neatly beside each other. And that's why saturated fats are solid at room temperature and unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature. Omega-6s, they're a bit kinky, but they're not quite as kinky as the omega-3s. So the idea is that it's this shape of this omega-3 molecule that makes the phospholipids unable to arrange themselves so neatly. And as a result, we know that if you have more omega-3 fatty acids in your phospholipid membrane, your membrane is now more fluid and more flexible. And the idea is that this also contributes to having a more flexible blood vessel that then has less pressure that it's exerting. So fun fact, sperm are made from omega-3s. And once again, it's that flexible nature of the omega-3 that enables the sperm's tail to sort of propel the sperm forward. So we see this throughout the body in many different areas. And this is just a study that showed that if you increase omega-3 fatty acid intakes, you have decreased arterial stiffness. So further illustrating this mechanism. So I think this is fascinating because if you look, 4 tablespoons of ground flaxseed per day can decrease systolic blood pressure, like we said, by 15 units, diastolic by 7. If you compare that to the average first-line blood pressure medication, just a single medication, not a combination, we expect a 15 millimeter of mercury systolic blood pressure reduction and a 10 millimeter mercury diastolic blood pressure reduction. So clearly, mill flax seeds, they're almost as good as our first-line blood pressure medications, which is pretty impressive. One very important fact, in order to absorb the omega-3s from flax seeds, they must be crushed. We can't digest the coat. So if you eat a flax seed whole, you just excrete it unchanged and you don't get the nutrients from it. The other thing is they're again, the double bonds, they're not very shelf stable. So they also are best if frozen. Now, if you're fact checking me, and you should be, if you look at the meta-analysis that look at flax seeds and blood pressure, it's very interesting because they will tell you that there is only on average a 1.77 millimeter mercury decrease in blood pressure with omega-3s. But this is a really important lesson here, which is that you can't just read the abstract of a study and feel like you've gotten the message of the study. Because when I dug deeper in this study, what I realized is that they're actually comparing apples and oranges. They combined studies of flax seeds with studies of flaxseed oil at all kinds of different doses and then put it all together and said, well, there's no effect. So my message to you is if you really want to know the truth about something, you have to read the tables because otherwise you might actually miss something that's actually apparent. So maybe you're thinking, well, what about the fish, the omega-3s from fish sources? Can this have the same effect? Research shows it can, but the problem is it's unsustainable to eat fish every single day, right? There aren't enough fish in the ocean. There's not enough to go around. Also, there's issues with dioxins and things like that. So yes, when you eat salmon, you're getting omega-3s, which are also helping with blood pressure, but it's probably not the option that we can go to every single day to get the dose that's been proven to have that effect. And then you're probably also wondering, well, what about omega-3 supplements? Isn't that a good option we could go down? Interestingly, the Cochrane review showed no effect on blood pressure when you take omega-3s in a supplement. One kind of golden rule of nutrition is that supplements never perform as well as foods. And there's so many different reasons why. In the realm of omega-3s, the reason why is there's probably a couple different reasons why. One, omega-3s are very, very vulnerable to oxidation. All the double bonds makes sense, right? And these supplements, we know, even if you buy the best quality supplement from the best provider, they're always like half of them are oxidized by the time you consume them. And that's actually a theory as to why these cardiovascular trials never work out, is because often you're ingesting something that is like an oxidized fatty acid. So you're actually doing more harm than good. The other thing to keep in mind is, of course, flax seeds have more than just omega-3s, right? Nature packaged these foods in such a way that there's a lot of synergies and there's a lot more going on than just one nutrient. Again, the dose is crucial and key, and these sorts of reviews always compare apples and oranges with many different doses. And finally, as I already alluded to, there's all these different types of omega-3s, right? And this study is about omega-3s in general. So is it the ALA, is it the DHA, is it the EPA? We're comparing all of these different things. So it makes sense to me that the Cochrane review would show no effect on blood pressure because it's more of a specific question that needs to be asked. I mentioned this already, stored in the fridge, double bonds, very vulnerable to oxidation. And you'll know if your omega-3 fat, if your flax seeds are spoiled because they'll taste fishy and disgusting. Okay, so that's flax seeds and blood pressure. But of course, no discussion of blood pressure is complete without a discussion of salt and sodium, right? So we know that salt is composed of both a positively charged sodium ion and a negatively charged chloride ion. And when you eat more salt, you have more salt in your bloodstream. And of course, we all remember from high school biology that water is a polar molecule with a very negative component to it. So when we have more positively charged sodium ions in the bloodstream, we then attract more of those negatively polar water molecules to that positive charge, which means we hold more water in the bloodstream, which means that water exerts more pressure on the walls of the vessel, which means we have a higher blood pressure, right? This is the premise of why dietary sodium is problematic when it comes to blood pressure. And of course, the first thing that patients always say is, I don't have a salt shaker, which is good. That's a good first step. But we also know that 77% of dietary sodium, it's not coming from the salt shaker. It's coming from processed foods and it's coming from restaurant foods. So to explore this a little more deeply, I have a game for you guys. We're going to play this Price is Right style. I'm going to show you a showcase, which is a meal, and you guys are going to guess how many milligrams of sodium you think is in this showcase. So we have here, this is actually very fitting, a hamburger. I didn't plan this. Hamburger, fries, and coleslaw. Keep in mind, the recommended amount of sodium for a day is about 1,500 milligrams. 2,300 milligrams is like the safe upper limit. I'll take some guesses. Who wants to guess how much sodium is in this meal, in this showcase? And of course, as close as you can without going over.
I'm going to say 2,800.
2,800. Okay. JB.
2801.
2801. I love it. I love it. I love it. Robert?
950.
950. Okay. Angelica?
1080.
1080. Any other guesses? Dr. Ohanian?
3,500.
3,500. Any other takers? 1,200. All right. Let's go through it. The hamburger alone contains 1,500 milligrams of sodium, right? So there's your day's worth. Can't eat anything else, just the hamburger. You throw in the fries, you get another 884. And then you add in the coleslaw, you get 382. If you put it all together, we have a whopping, I know, Richard was close, but he was over. I actually don't know who it ended up being because.
As long as JB was.
Who was it? I'm not sure. Was it Angelica? Yeah, because you guessed 10-8. There we go. There we go. So there we go. The other thing is you can never predict how much sodium is going to be inside something. So let's imagine you go to Dunkin' Donuts and you're choosing between this corn muffin and the wake up wrap, which has eggs, cheese, and bacon. Which do you think has more sodium? Who thinks it's the corn muffin?
I'm going to say yes.
And who thinks it's the wake up wrap?
I know that thing has sodium.
Yeah, so This astounds me every time I see numbers like this, which is like you would think that the cheese and the bacon and the eggs would blow the corn muffin out of the water, but you can find sodium in all kinds of places. Here's another one. Let's say you go to Chick-fil-A and you're trying to decide between the Cobb salad and the original Chick-fil-A chicken sandwich, which has more sodium. Who thinks it's the Cobb salad?
With dressing.
And with dressing. And who thinks it's the original sandwich? Okay, so these numbers astound me. It's a lot more. It's a lot more. So again, sodium is just kind of everywhere, and you can't always predict how much you're going to find in any given place. So now let's turn our attention to processed foods. So which processed food do you think contributes the greatest amount of sodium to the average American diet? Do you think it's soups and canned foods? Is it bread? Or is it salty snacks like chips and that sort of stuff? So who thinks it's the canned foods? Who thinks it's bread? And who thinks it's salty snacks? Okay, yeah, so it's bread. So you guys are good. Maybe I made these too easy. But if you look at the top 10 sources of sodium in the American diet, bread tops it off. And the reason is not because bread, like one slice of bread is so rich in sodium, but it's because people eat so much of it, right? So that ends up being the greatest amount. Number 2 is pizza, then hamburgers and sandwiches, cold cuts and cured meats, soups, burritos and tacos, savory snacks is number 7, chicken number 8, cheese number 9, and then interestingly, eggs and omelets number 10. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that these are population averages, right? The patient that's sitting in front of you may very well be getting all of their sodium from chips or from their cheese and their cold cuts that they eat every day. But at the population level, this is how things stack up. This is an interesting tool that you might want to try yourself, and if you have the right patient, you could recommend it to them. It's a sodium calculator where basically you put in what you typically eat, and it's a validated tool. I actually know the scientist who created it. I was actually in the study where they validated it. I had to do like a 24-hour urine sodium collection and like report what I ate, et cetera, et cetera. So I know that it's good data, and they kind of estimate how much sodium you're eating based on your little kind of like self-report of what you eat every day. So that's one tool that you might check out if you're interested. Now, the other thing that is so fascinating about sodium and blood pressure is this concept called salt sensitivity. So it's the idea that sodium doesn't actually affect everyone's blood pressure the same way. We know some people can eat as much salt as they want and their blood pressure doesn't increase, and other people eat a very small amount and they do get this large increase. I want to explore this for a second because, like I said, I think it's quite fascinating. There are genetic tests that can tell you if you're salt sensitive or not. Those things where, you take your saliva, you mail it off, and they give you a report back on your genes and how you need to change your lifestyle based on them. But you don't actually have to do this in order to get some sense of some groups that may be more salt sensitive compared to others. So what we know from the literature is that African Americans are uniquely salt sensitive. So this is a study that shows you the average increase in systolic blood pressure when varying amounts of sodium are fed to Caucasian Americans and African Americans. And what you can see is that that no matter what amount of salt is eaten, the African Americans are having a significantly higher increase in their systolic blood pressure compared to the Caucasian Americans. And this increases as the sodium intake increases. But there's something very interesting about this, which is that as potassium intakes increase, racial disparities in blood pressure disappear. And I'm going to show you a couple of different pieces of data that demonstrate this. But here you can see that as their potassium intakes along the x-axis increase, the differences between the two groups go down. So this is a study where they took African Americans and Caucasian Americans. They fed them varying amounts of potassium along the x-axis. And then they compared the change in blood pressure in relation to a salt load that they consumed. And what you can see is that when they had low potassium intakes, there's this clear difference between the African Americans and the Caucasian Americans. But then when you get up to a very high potassium intake, that difference disappears. So this is very, very interesting. Once again, just like the balance between omega-3s and omega-6 fatty acids has been disrupted by our modern diets, sodium and potassium also exist in a balance. Historically, we ate 7 times more potassium than sodium. Today, we eat 3 times more sodium than potassium, and this is part of the problem. So this is a study published in the New England Journal that basically showed for everyone, irrespective of who they are, where they're from, increasing potassium intakes lead to lower blood pressure. And this is demonstrated for systolic blood pressure as well as diastolic blood pressure. And this has to do with what's happening at the distal convoluted tubule. It's actually at the same site where thiazide diuretics act. What we know is that a lot of the body's sodium regulation is happening at the level of the sodium chloride cotransporter at the distal convoluted tubule. So if you have a low serum sodium, the sodium chloride cotransporter is going to reabsorb more salt to increase your blood pressure. That's pretty simple and that makes sense. But what also happens is if you have a low dietary potassium level, and that's a low serum potassium level, your sodium chloride cotransporter, for some reason, then also reabsorbs more salt. It has to do, I think, with what's going on with the channels on the other side of the cell. So low potassium diets also increase blood pressure by the reabsorption of sodium. And the worst thing is if you have a low potassium diet that is also high in sodium, now for some reason, paradoxically, the sodium chloride cotransporter reabsorbs even more salt and produces an even higher blood pressure. So the conclusion of this study published in the New England Journal was that the only thing worse than a high sodium diet is a high sodium diet that is also low in potassium. And that is what we've got. So this is data that showed that 99.4% of Americans consume more than 1,500 milligrams of sodium, the recommended amount, and less than 2.5% consume 4,700 milligrams of potassium, which is the recommendation for potassium. I do want to talk about the recommendation. So if you remember from that slide a moment ago, when we looked at those disparities disappearing, it happened around 4,700 milligrams, which also happened to be the previous recommendation for potassium intakes. So there is this group called the Institute of Medicine. They're a non-governmental organization located in Washington. They convene experts who come together to basically tell us how much we should eat of all of the different vitamins and minerals. They get together from time to time and revise their recommendations. Prior to 2019, they said everyone should eat 4,700 milligrams of potassium per day. That makes sense based on the data we looked at, because we saw like that's an amount that can eliminate disparities in salt sensitivity. Sounds reasonable. Interestingly, after 2019, they revised their recommendations and they actually lowered it. They said women should have 2,600 milligrams per day and men should have 3,400. The important thing that I want you guys to recognize about this is that the recommendations that are put out by the Institute of Medicine are for healthy populations. So this probably is accurate for a population that's healthy, but it's not for hypertensive populations. And it's not based on different ethnic groups and such. So people get really worked up about these recommendations, but at the end of the day, like, it's very difficult. They are what they are. They're population averages. And you have to remember that the individual who's sitting in front of you is unique and may, this might be what's right for them, or maybe the old recommendation might be what's right for them. But definitely these recommendations are for healthy populations, not sick and multi-morbidly chronic disease populations. Okay, so let's keep talking about potassium for a moment. What do you think is the best dietary source of potassium? Is it potatoes, avocados, 3/4 of a cup, I should say 1 potato, 1 avocado, 3/4 of a cup of beans, or 1 banana? Think about it for a moment, and I'll get you guys to guess. So who thinks it's the potato? Who thinks it's the avocado? 3/4 of a cup of beans, and 1 banana. Okay, let's take a look. They're actually in order. So yeah, potatoes top it off. 926 milligrams of potassium per potato. By the way, this applies to both white and sweet potatoes. They're both about the same. The avocados next with 690. 3/4 of a cup of beans have 540, and then the bananas. Each banana has about 422.
It's the skin, right? That's the skin.
In the potato, yeah. Sorry, that's a good point. You must eat the skin in order to get the maximum amount of potassium. If you stack up the top dietary sources of potassium, they're right here. You can see that it's mostly, vegetables basically, and some fruits and beans. If you eat low sodium tomato juice, you can get some potassium. Salsa has a lot of potassium, which is good to know in tomato sauce. Halibut and tuna fish do okay, but they're unique among fish. It's not a universal thing. Yogurt and milk have a small amount as well. And yeah, so these are the best sources. But as you can see, if you're aiming for 4,700 milligrams per day, you're going to need to eat a lot of these foods in order to get there. Is it possible? It's theoretically possible. It would just be very difficult. So you'd have to eat bananas and yogurt for breakfast, and then like a snack of honeydew melon, and then an avocado and some tomato juice at your lunch, and then another snack of cantaloupe melon and some raisins. At dinner, you'd have to have, specifically halibut fish, some beans, maybe some spinach, and then a snack of cherries. And if you did all of that, you would get your 4,700 milligrams of potassium. But when you look at the data, so the top sources of potassium in the American diet, potatoes, that kind of makes sense. But then interestingly, milk, okay, because milk has some. But then coffee and tea, which are like not even legitimate sources, manage to contribute most of the potassium that we eat. So it's possible to get that amount, but also the more people get, the better. So it's, you just aim for as much as you can get. Now, you're probably thinking, well, a lot of our patients with high blood pressure are taking ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers, right, which are theoretically potassium-sparing medications that could theoretically increase people's potassium levels. This is a study also actually done by someone I went to grad school with, but they basically took a hypertensive population. They fed them 10 servings of fruits and vegetables every day. And these people were on ACE inhibitors and ARBs, and they wanted to see if they were going to increase their risk for hyperkalemia by being on that very, very high fruit and vegetable diet. And what they showed is that it didn't. So if you have patients on ACE and ARBs, you don't have to worry about telling them to eat more potassium. It probably is not going to give them hyperkalemia. And then, of course, there's our chronic kidney disease patients, right? There's also issues around potassium intakes in this population, who, of course, typically also has high blood pressure. It's interesting, different people give different recommendations, but it seems the consensus is that unless they are hyperkalemic, we probably don't need to limit their potassium intake. So the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics recommends that if they have CKD stage 3 to 5, only if they have hyperkalemia should you limit their dietary potassium. And you can see, limited to less than 2.4 grams per day. Like most people are not even going to be anywhere near that. And then the National Kidney Foundation's Quality Initiative guidelines, they said limit it to 2 to 4. But again, how many people are going to be consuming more than 4 grams per day? Probably not that many. So I don't think this is probably as big an issue as it sometimes feels like it is. This is really fascinating. So this is data published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, which is the top nutrition journal in the world. And I can personally attest to the rigorous nature of the peer review process in this journal based on the large number of my own studies that have been rejected by this journal. But if your research isn't good, it can't get, let's put it this way, if your research is good, if your research is published in this journal, it is very good research. So that's why I have faith in this finding, which is interesting because it basically showed, it's based on the NHANES data, which is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. It's been done since the 1960s in the US. They follow up with people every few years, track what they're eating and how they're doing in terms of their health. So it's based on 36,000 people, and they basically showed that even in patients with reduced kidney function, the more potassium they ate, the lower their risk for mortality. So all of this is to suggest you shouldn't be afraid of potassium in this population. And of course, you're probably thinking, well, let's just do this the easy way. Let's just give everyone a potassium supplement. We do know from studies that show that 2,500 milligrams of supplemental potassium does decrease blood pressure. But again, increasing potassium-rich foods is about more than just potassium, because part of what we're doing is we're kind of getting people to, we're trying to displace those high sodium foods, right? So if we get them snacking on cantaloupe melon and honeydew melon, maybe they're not going to snack on that high sodium food. Whereas putting the supplement into their diet doesn't shift their diet in the same way. And of course, the other thing is we want to think big picture. When we get our patients to eat more fruits and vegetables, we're not just decreasing their risk for high blood pressure, we're decreasing their risk for every other disease and all-cause mortality. So I always like to try to promote diet first over supplements. So all of that being said, what do we tell our patients? So one of my little passion projects is I love to find ways to translate this in simple terms to our patients in ways that are meaningful and actionable. Ever since I arrived here, I've been very inspired by our patient population because I've never seen so many like out of control diabetics and so many like really high blood pressure levels and a population that is so far, like often very open and accepting of information and appreciative of information. So like I said, I've been very inspired and I've been busy at work on the weekends trying to come up with ways to give them the information that I want them to have. So for blood pressure, this is what I've come up with. Very simple, one pager, one side. So it's like to lower blood pressure, you want to decrease your sodium, eat less of these foods. One thing I put on here is it's arbitrary, but when you look at a nutrition facts table, this is from other guidelines. I just say any food with more than 340 milligrams of sodium is a high sodium food. So people kind of have a benchmark to put into perspective what they're eating. giving this to patients, often they're like, oh, it's the cheese. Oh, it's the cheese that I'm eating. Like I find I'm getting a good response to, or the cold cut. Some things are not really thinking about as being salty that are. But we don't want to just tell our patients what they can't eat, and we don't want to just take things away from them. We also want to give them encouragement about what they should eat. So the flip side of this guide shows you to lower blood pressure, increase your potassium intakes. And I just tell people, eat as many of these foods as possible every day, and the more of them that you eat, the better. And usually people will be like, oh yeah, I could eat a little more of this, or I could eat a little more of that. And also sometimes they're encouraged because they're like, you know what, I am doing this. And then you're validating them for something that they're already doing. So if you are interested, I have a website, nutrition-prescriptions.com. So you can get this from there and give it to your patients. I'm kind of working through these and changing them and tinkering with them as I see how people respond to them. But that's what I do for blood pressure. So we've spent a good amount of time talking about blood pressure, and we haven't even really mentioned or gotten into the DASH diet yet. So let's talk about that for a moment. What is the DASH diet? Fundamentally, it's a low sodium, high potassium diet. If you look at it, it's just this like generally healthy diet. To be honest, it looks a lot like the 1992 American Food Guide pyramid. So this is like the food guide that everybody makes fun of and says like, oh, it's so terrible. What were we thinking? What were we telling people? It's been revolutionized. But really, that's basically what it is. It's just a generally healthy diet. And part of the reason it's designed this way is because they want it to be something that people can actually adhere to and something that people can actually adopt. It's not too overly strict. When you look at the numbers, so this is based on a meta-analysis of 8 randomized controlled trials of patients with uncontrolled hypertension. The average systolic blood pressure decrease is 6 millimeters of mercury, and the average diastolic decrease is 3. It doesn't appear to be that much. However, keep in mind, it's a meta-analysis. This is very conservative data, and there are certain individuals who are going to get way more benefit from this diet. This is, again, at the population level, on average, what you're going to see. So some people criticize the DASH diet because they say it doesn't go far enough. And we know that if you eat a whole food plant-based diet, you can decrease systolic blood pressure by 16 and diastolic by 9. One thing that's not fair about this comparison is the whole food plant-based diets have only been tried in like trials. Whereas again, the DASH diet, we're talking meta-analyses. So again, this is a bit more rigorous data. That's a bit less rigorous data. So maybe that would come down a bit when we have more trials and average them all together. But again, it just shows you that you can go farther if you want, and if you have a patient who's interested. Let's just break down what these diets really are. So we said the DASH diet is kind of like the 1992 American Food Guide. Whole food plant-based diets basically have tons of vegetables, tons of beans, your fruits, your nuts, your seeds, no meat, no eggs, no dairy, no processed food. And I think that's a really important distinction to make because I think there's a lot of confusion around plant-based diets versus vegan diets. So I think of the plant-based people as the people who just eat plants and beans. And the vegan people kind of define themselves as what they don't eat. They don't eat meat and dairy. A lot of patients come to me and they say, oh yes, I'm making dietary improvements. I'm eating less meat, which could be healthy, but then it depends on what they're replacing that meat with. And I always feel like it doesn't guarantee that they're necessarily improving their health because we know that you could be on a vegan diet, but you could still be eating vegan chocolate cake. You can still be eating Lay's potato chips. You can still be eating all these processed foods that replace meat that often have a lot of sodium or other things. So it's not a guarantee that just by taking meat out, you're automatically improving your diet. So that's something that I encounter quite a bit with patients. So that is everything that I have to say about blood pressure. So we'll recap it. So we talked about how flax seeds have potent blood pressure lowering capabilities. We talked about how increased dietary sodium is only half of the equation. The other half of the equation is our insufficient potassium intakes. We talked about how increased potassium can eliminate racial disparities in salt sensitivity. And finally, we talked about how the DASH diet is good and plant-based diets are potentially even better for lowering blood pressure. So the next topic that I want to get into is diabetes. And for diabetes, I have a case for you guys. So this case is a 51-year-old male. He's overweight. His A1C is 6%. And he comes to you and he says, I want to prevent diabetes. What is more effective? Telling him to eat according to the 1992 American Food Guide pyramid with 150 minutes of exercise per week, or starting him on metformin right now? What do you guys think will decrease his risk of progressing to diabetes better? Who thinks it's the Food Guide pyramid? And who thinks it's metformin? Okay. Yeah, so it's the Food Guide pyramid. It's interesting because it's always interesting to me when you can show that diet is more effective than the pills that we have worked so hard to get a license to prescribe, right? If you put someone on the food guide pyramid with 150 minutes of exercise, 5 out of 100 will go on to develop diabetes. If you start them on metformin right then and there, 8 out of 100 go on to develop diabetes. So when it comes to diabetes prevention, diet is more effective than medications. And again, it's the old food guide, right? This is not a very strict diet. This is like quite liberal and gives you a lot of flexibility. So let's say we continue this case. This gentleman is 63. He's still overweight. His A1C is now 6.5%. So you're telling him that he has diabetes. And he says to you, can I reverse my diabetes? What do you tell him? Yes, you can, or no, it's too late. Who says yes? Who says no? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. You can reverse diabetes. So this is research that came out earlier this year, which showed that low carbohydrate diets initiated in the first year of a type 2 diabetes diagnosis enabled remission in 70% of patients. So I think that's pretty impressive. The question we have to ask, though, is what is a low carb diet and what does this actually look like? Because again, it can mean different things to different people. In this particular study, a low carb diet was 130 grams of carbohydrates per day. So what does that actually look like? Well, you could have half of a cup of oatmeal for breakfast, a half of a cup of quinoa at lunch, an apple, and 1 cup of pasta for dinner. So it's actually a fair amount. Like you can eat carbohydrates, just not excessive amounts of carbohydrates. But I also want to mention, we know that if you just lose 10 to 15% of your body weight, that can also put diabetes into remission. So there's different ways to get there. And I find the topic of weight loss to be an extraordinarily different one to broach with patients. Nobody needs to be told that they should lose weight. Most people want to lose weight. My approach right now is I kind of have a do's and don'ts of weight loss handout where I give people ideas of things that I think would be helpful and things that I think would be not helpful to just kind of guide them on that path. So that's another guide that you could try with your patients if you're interested. Let's continue this case. So now he's 63. He's still overweight. His A1C is climbing and it's 6.8. And he says, I can't cut carbs. Isn't there anything else? Well, indeed there is. So I love carbohydrates, by the way. I think they're the best food group there is. And so cutting carbs, it's the most obvious way that you can lower someone's blood sugar, but it's definitely not the only way. And we're going to look at some examples of ways to eat carbohydrates that are sort of like smart and strategic ways to do so. So when I think about how to mitigate the effects of carbohydrates, I kind of have this framework that almost works out to be the 5 W's. So it has to do with what type of carbs you're eating, who the carbs are being eaten with, how they're being eaten, when they're being eaten, the why. I sort of have a why. I don't have a where, but it almost works out. So let's start with what type of carbs are being eaten. So the best framework that I know of for comparing carbohydrates based on their quality is this thing called the glycemic index. The glycemic index is a system that basically ranks carbohydrates and sugars based on how quickly they're digested and absorbed, which also translates into how the magnitude with which they spike our blood sugar. The glycemic index was invented at the University of Toronto in the 1980s. This is a picture of me at my thesis defense. This is the inventor of the glycemic index. He used to fall asleep and look around the room when I was talking, but that's okay. It was a pleasure just to interact and work with him. But it's interesting, the story of how they invented this. So the story is they got dialysis tubing, which is permeable to glucose. They collected the saliva of everyone in the lab because saliva is a source of amylase, which is the digestive enzyme for carbohydrates. And then they took different types of carb and put it in their saliva mixture and measured the transfer of the glucose across the dialysis tubing, which is their proxy for digestion and absorption. And what they found was that different carbs were digested, by the amylase at different rates, and then transferred into the bloodstream, so to speak, at different rates as well. So what the glycemic index teaches us is that something like white rice is rapidly digested and rapidly absorbed. It spikes our blood sugar. Our body releases a ton of insulin to deal with that glucose rush to then bring things back down to baseline. On the other hand, parboiled rice is digested more slowly and absorbed more slowly. You get a gentler rise in blood sugar. Your body then doesn't need to release as much insulin to bring you back down to baseline. So the glycemic index tells us white rice has a high glycemic index of 64. Higher numbers are bad and lower numbers are good. And parboiled rice has a lower glycemic index of 51. So all foods are ranked from 0 to 100. Again, like I said, lower is better. This is a little handout I give my patients, and I basically tell them, like, your low glycemic index are your staples. Those are the ones you eat every day and you eat pretty freely. Your medium ones you want to think about, be mindful of the portion size with. And then your high glycemic index carbs are just your treats. You can eat them. Sometimes you just don't want them to be your staple that you're eating every single day. The glycemic index teaches us like some very just interesting things. Like, for example, al dente pasta has a lower glycemic index than overcooked pasta or even just regularly cooked pasta. So if you undercook your pasta, it doesn't have the same effect. And that's, of course, how people would actually eat it in Italy. Boiled sweet potatoes have a significantly lower glycemic index compared to boiled white potatoes. And this is, you can tell I like carbs with like my focus here. Bow tie or farfalle pasta has a lower glycemic index than penny pasta. So even the shape of the pasta matters and changes your digestion of it. This is a study where they compared low glycemic load diets for people with poorly controlled diabetes to 2,000 milligrams of metformin per day. And what you can see is that being on a low glycemic load diet, and glycemic load basically means they're low glycemic index foods at a controlled portion size, lowered A1C by 1.04%, whereas metformin lowers it by about 1.38. So again, you can see pretty meaningful decreases in A1C for our patients. My pet peeve is when people use the glycemic index to villainize fruit. So this is like, I don't know, some troll on the internet posted this on like some lecture that I have up somewhere. And they're like, oh, you know, great info, but you got to be cautious with fruit because sugar is too high and sugar is sugar, which we could have a whole debate about. But the point is, yes, some fruits are high in terms of their glycemic index. But I don't think this is the problem. Like, how many people are getting diabetes because they're eating so many overripe bananas, right? And like, I actually do know someone who eats whole watermelons, but that's not the average person. So I don't think this is the problem. And I think sometimes we focus on the wrong things. Okay, so that was the what type of carbs are being eaten. And now we're going to talk, this is like my favorite part. We're going to talk about who the carbs are being eaten with. And what I mean by that is like, what other foods are the carbs being eaten with? So first off, we know that if you eat carbs with protein, it lowers the resultant blood sugar spike. And the more protein you eat with your carbs, the better. So for example, if you have a cup of rice with 1/8 of a cup of black beans, your resultant blood sugar level, I'm talking about the peak blood sugar, goes down by about 4% compared to if you ate that rice alone. So not too much of a benefit. But then if you eat that cup of rice with 1/4 cup of beans, you get a decrease of 6%, still not that much. But check out what happens if you have 1 cup of rice with 3/4 of a cup of beans. Now you've decreased your peak blood sugar level by about 1/3. So I think that's pretty good. And other sources of protein do the same thing. So this is a study where they compared eating a slice of white bread alone to eating a slice of white bread with almonds. And what you can see is that it brings the peak blood sugar down by about 20%. So that's pretty good. You guys are gonna love this one. So if you eat macaroni alone, the glycemic index is 61. If you eat your macaroni with 4 1-inch cubes of cheddar cheese, you bring it significantly down. Again, because cheese, it has two things, right? It has protein and it has fat. So I'm not saying that macaroni and cheese is healthy. I'm just saying it does technically lower the glycemic index of those carbs. Even better, if you eat a slice of bread alone, your peak blood sugar is about 131. If you eat it with butter, you can bring that level down by about 13%, and you can lower the glycemic index substantially. So again, not necessarily advocating for this, but just so that you guys are aware of how all of these things work. And this is because different foods are digested at different rates. We know that carbs are digested the fastest, fat is digested the slowest, and protein is somewhere in the middle. So the idea is if you mix more of these things together, it just takes your body longer. Also, when you mix like carbs and fat, for example, those lipid molecules then like glob onto the starch molecule and the enzymes just can't reach it. So it just makes the body work harder and things take longer and the blood glucose spike is smaller. This is interesting too, and I'm going somewhere with this. If you eat vinegar with carbs, this also slows digestion and decreases the magnitude of the blood glucose spike. I remember people saying to me like, oh, like you got to drink your apple cider vinegar in the morning. And for the longest time, I didn't understand where that was even coming from or what people thought they were going to benefit from it. But there's something interesting going on, which is that vinegar, which is acid denatures proteins, right? And enzymes are proteins. So the theory is that if you eat vinegar, for example, you actually knock off some of your carbohydrate digesting enzymes. And in doing so, you can't digest those carbs as quickly. And then that also results in a lower blood sugar spike. Okay, continuing on the how are the carbs being eaten theme. That was who. Now we're how. How are the carbs being eaten? So this is a study that showed that if you eat carbohydrates before you eat vegetables, your blood sugar after 30 minutes is 225. But if you eat vegetables before you eat carbs, now you've brought that blood sugar spike down by 24%. We think that part of this is because of fiber. So we know that certain fibers dissolve in water. So when you eat those fibers, they dissolve in water and they actually form basically a gel inside your intestines. And that gel then traps the starch and glucose molecules, preventing them from being absorbed. But there's more. Dietary fiber also increases levels of this particular hormone, which is glucagon-like peptide 1, or GLP-1. And as we all know, GLP-1 minimizes postprandial glucose excursions. That's why we give it to diabetics, and it increases satiety. So the way I see it, dietary fiber is basically nature's Ozempic, right? Because we're doing the same thing. We're increasing GLP-1, and that's having an effect for weight loss. Yeah.
Does it matter whether it's soluble or insoluble fiber?
So in terms of the GLP-1 effect, I think it's all fiber, but I'm going to get into more of a discussion of soluble versus insoluble actually later on, because it does matter for certain things. But my understanding for GLP-1 is I think it's total dietary fiber. And this is a study that showed that the more fiber you eat, the more weight loss you have, independent of calorie restriction. So this is pointing to the idea that indeed, it has some sort of other effect, independent of like displacing other foods and stuff like that on promoting weight loss. And of course, the more fiber you eat, the lower your risk for diabetes. This is a dose response meta-analysis. And you can see as fiber intake increases along the x-axis, relative risk goes down lower and lower and lower. If we plot onto this, the recommended fiber intakes for men and for women, they chart right there. So you would have to actually eat pretty much more than what's recommended for a woman. And if you eat more than what's recommended for a man, you'll get additional benefits. Our fiber recommendations are highly criticized. People say we should be eating at least double of what, again, the Institute of Medicine recommends, because, again, these things are not always perfect. But if we plot on here the average fiber intake, it's a lot less. So there's definitely room for improvement when it comes to fiber. So I have this fiber guide that I give my patients. Basically, on one side, I show people what's the amount of fiber that's recommended based on whether they're male or female and based on their age group. And then on the other side, I show people basically how much fiber is in all of the different fiber-rich foods. And again, it's quite interesting because most people don't know how much they need, and most people don't realize how much they're getting. And in a few seconds, you can kind of have a sense of what's going on there. Okay, so continuing along the theme of how are the carbs being eaten, this is another one that shows that if you eat carbs alone, your peak glucose happens 75 minutes after you ate those carbs. But if you eat oil or really any kind of fat before you eat those carbohydrates, now your peak glucose is 140 minutes later. So, and this helps you to feel full for longer, basically like 1 hour later. So things that reduce glucose levels. We've talked about vegetables, which contain fiber. We've talked about oil, and we've talked about vinegar. When I think about vegetables, oil, and vinegar, I think it sounds like a salad, right? So what this shows us is that basically our, cultural tradition of eating a salad, perhaps as a first course, is actually a metabolically good thing, because you're getting your fiber, you're getting your vinegar, you're getting, if it's a vinaigrette dressing, of course, you're getting your olive oil or your oil of any sort, and this is going to help decrease the effects of the carbohydrates that you're perhaps going to eat later on in the meal. I also have to hate on this for a second. Fat-free salad dressing bothers me a lot. It's the worst thing that was ever invented, because if you think about it, you want the fat on that salad, right? If you put fat-free salad dressing on your salad, now you're not going to get that metabolic effect of having fat before you ate your carbs. The other thing, and I'm not going to get into this in too much detail, but you need fat in order to absorb certain nutrients that are in vegetables. So if you don't have fat, you're missing out. It's okay. Don't eat fat-free salad dressing. Okay, so continuing on the theme of how the carbs are being eaten. Okay, this is like one of my favorite things. I only learned about this recently, and this has like even changed my own life. So it's not what you eat that matters. It's the order that you eat it in. So this was a study where they fed people carbs, protein, and vegetables. Okay, and they fed them rice for the carbs, they fed them chicken for the protein, and they fed them bok choy for the vegetables. And they're going to feed these things in all different orders. And we're going to look at how high the blood sugar increased after they ate them. So let's say you eat carbs first, you eat your rice, and then you eat your protein and your vegetables after. Your blood sugar increases by 66 milligrams per deciliter. What if you just eat them all at the same time, mixed together? Well, now your blood sugar only increases by 49. That's a 26% reduction. What if you eat vegetables first and then the protein and the carbs? Now your resultant blood sugar is only 42 milligrams per deciliter higher. That's a 36% reduction. What if you eat protein first and then the vegetables and then the carbs? Now you've got a 39 milligram per deciliter decrease, which is a increase, which is a 42% decrease. And if you eat the vegetables first and then you eat the protein and then you eat the carbs, you get a 38 milligram per deciliter decrease, which is a 41% reduction. So this is really cool because you're literally eating the exact same thing. You just changed the order that you ate it in. And when I look at this, I kind of feel like, other than like after these two, like I kind of see these ones as being basically the same. As long as you get like something into your abdomen before you eat your carb, you're getting a pretty good reduction. I think that's cool. This also teaches us that like the breadbasket appetizer is a very problematic social convention, right? This idea that we're going to have bread first is actually going to give us the biggest blood sugar spike. So you tell your diabetic patients, like, if you want to eat the like nice sourdough bread at whatever restaurant they go to, you just eat it at the end, or you put like butter on it. Just kidding, but you technically could. Yeah, so that's something to think about. Okay, this is good too. When are the carbs being eaten? So interestingly, you can eat carbs at lunch, the exact same amount of carbs at dinner, and your blood sugar spike is 20% higher at dinner. And breakfast would also be like pretty equivalent to lunch. This is because all of our hormones follow a circadian rhythm, right? So this shows you, if you look at insulin in green, you can see insulin levels are higher later in the day. That's because we're less sensitive to insulin. Our body has to release more to work harder. And this is why we shouldn't eat carbs later in the day, because our body doesn't want them then. When I think about it, I kind of like to use the car analogy. Humans are like cars, right? We need fuel. Carbs are our fuel. If we fill the gas tank before a long drive, it makes more sense than driving on empty and then filling the gas tank, right? So that's why you want to eat carbs earlier in the day before you go out and do all your work and physical activity. There's this cute little saying that I sometimes say to patients: eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. It's totally counter to what we do as a society, but it actually makes a lot of sense metabolically. And you also don't have to follow this religiously. The more you front load your day, the better. Even if your dinner and your breakfast, they are the same size, and your lunch is the biggest meal, anything you can do to not make dinner the biggest meal is going to be helpful. Okay, so our case, back to it. 63-year-old male, he's still overweight. His A1C is climbing. It's now 6.8%. And of course, he comes in and he says to you, what do you think of intermittent fasting? These questions are always difficult, but let's talk about intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating for a second. So intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating means a lot of different things. So if anytime someone tells you they're doing this, you have to be like, what are you actually doing? Because different people do different things. So there are some people who like fast for 16 hours a day and eat for 8 hours. People who fast for 18 hours a day and only eat for 6 hours. There's some people who eat 5 days of the week and fast 2 days of the week. Some people fast every other day of the week. So the point is, lots of different protocols. Some I think can be strategic. Some I think are not strategic at all. It all depends on how it's done. But what I want to show you is this study. This is a study where they took diabetics. They had been diagnosed in the last 5 years. They had A1Cs that were above target. And they put them on a protocol where they ate all of their meals between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. and they fasted for 14 hours overnight. This was for 12 weeks. They were instructed that they could not overeat. And what they showed was that 12 weeks later, just by narrowing the window that they ate at and having them stop eating after 6 p.m., their A1Cs went down by 1.54%. I think that's pretty remarkable, considering that they changed nothing else but the time during which they were eating. And to put that into perspective, that's better than metformin, right? We're actually getting a better outcome. Now, I will, again, you have to read the fine print and you have to read the tables. When I looked deeply at the results of this study, what you can see is that actually by narrowing their eating window, the amount of calories that they're eating did decrease. Not that they were telling them to restrict their calories, but simply like they couldn't have those midnight snacks. They couldn't have that extra serving, after dinner. So they weren't being told to decrease their calories, but they kind of inadvertently did. So it's not truly just an effect of time restriction. It's also what time restriction does to how much food we can physically get into ourselves. But I love this. I think this is very helpful for our patients. The last one, why are you eating carbs? This gets at like emotional eating and stress eating and all of those factors that also contribute to the reason why someone might be choosing a certain food. I'm not going to spend too much time dwelling on that. I told you I don't have a where are you eating the carbs. I'll keep thinking about that maybe next time. But this is what I created again after my first week at Ghent Family Medicine, and I was like, oh my gosh, so many out of control A1Cs. So many things I want to tell these patients. How do I put it all into one place? So this is my 11 ways to lower blood sugar levels. It's still a bit wordy. I'm working on it. I think I'm going to make it more graphic, but for now, it basically outlines all the things I just told you guys. And then on the back, I have the glycemic index. So like I said, a little bit wordy, but usually what I'll do is I'll pick one, like whatever I think that patient is going to benefit most from. I might tell them, here's the one that I want you to focus on. Maybe it's the eat more fiber rich foods. Maybe it's the like fast for 14 hours overnight. And then just call their attention to it and make it a goal for them. So that's everything that I wanted to say about diabetes and nutrition. And to recap, when it comes to diabetes prevention, the 1992 Food Guide Pyramid and exercise is the best way to is better for preventing diabetes compared to metformin. Low carb diets or 10 to 15% of weight loss can reverse diabetes. And then we talked about all the ways to mitigate the effects of carbs. So combining carbs with protein and fat, eating salad dressed with olive oil and a vinaigrette prior to eating carbs, eating your carbs at the end of your meal, eating carbs earlier in the day instead of later in the day, and then trying to eat all your food between 8 to 6 and fasting for 14 hours overnight. Okay, what time are we at? Okay, so we have one section left. We'll jump into it. So the last section, nutrition and cholesterol. Once again, we'll revisit, oh, I didn't animate this properly. There we go. Dietary fat family tree. No conversation about cholesterol can really happen without addressing saturated fat first. So saturated fat, as I said earlier, was the fat that Americans ate for hundreds of years. And it was never a problem until the 1950s and 60s when industrial feedlots were invented. Because then for the first time, once again, we could eat unprecedented amounts of saturated fat, which we didn't have access to before. And that's when things became a bit of a problem. Because when you think about our ancestors, they had to work very, very hard to eat meat, right? They were not hunting and killing an animal 3 times a day. So meat, I think, is just like a treat food and the saturated fat that comes with it. So we know that saturated fat increases LDL cholesterol levels, right? And we're getting saturated fat from butter, from red meat, from cheese, from cow's milk, from coconut oil, and from lard and beef tallow. Now, according to some studies, saturated fats, despite their ability to raise LDL cholesterol, do not increase risk for cardiovascular disease or death, right? It's this disconnect. It lowers the risk factor or the marker of disease, but it doesn't actually lower the outcome. That being said, not all studies agree. The latest Cochrane review on the topic, published in 2020, did show that if you decrease saturated fat, you decrease cardiovascular disease events by 21%. They did show that it had no effect on mortality, but as far as I'm concerned, you want to prevent that event, right? A heart attack is a bad enough thing that it's worth making the recommendation for. And I think the reason there's this confusion is because if you take something out of the diet, the question is, what do you put in its place? And the thing is, you can take out certain things, you can take out saturated fat, but if you replace that with like low quality carbohydrates, then probably you're still going to have that heart attack. And then we're telling people saturated fat doesn't matter. But really the question is, what have you exchanged it for? And I think that's where the disagreement comes in these sorts of studies. So what is the best thing that we can replace saturated fat with? Well, if we go back to our tree, it's monounsaturated fats, also known as MUFAs, my favorite fats. So this is really what the Mediterranean diet is all about. The thing I love about studies of the Mediterranean diet is when, again, when you read these studies and you read the protocol, they say like, we basically dropped off a 5-gallon tin of olive oil at their home and told them to eat as much as they wanted. So it's rare in nutrition that you can give people such a free-for-all. I would say if you visit the basement of any like European family's home, you will find those like 5-gallon tins of olive oil like en masse. I will also say when I moved to Norfolk, my father's greatest concern was where I would get my olive oil from. So olive oil is very near and dear to me. And this is probably the best thing we can replace our saturated fat with. The other thing I want to point out about the MUFA fats, and part of what makes them so interesting and so healthy, is that they are fruit fats, right? They're the only fat that we're actually getting from fruit, right? It's coming from olives, it's coming from avocados. So not only is the chemical structure fundamentally different, but also you're getting all these nutrients in that fat food, which makes it unique. Okay, I didn't animate this properly. There is another arm to the dietary fat family tree that I haven't discussed yet, but I want to talk about for a moment, and that is trans fats. And they're technically a MUFA fat, but a synthetically created MUFA fat, so they don't totally count. So what are trans fats? Well, trans fats were invented at the turn of the last century when they realized that they could take fats that were liquid at room temperature, and by adding a hydrogen ion, make them solid at room temperature. So as you can see, that you had this like liquid at room temperature, kinky molecule, right? Cis double bond. You add a hydrogen, now you have a trans double bond. Now you have a type of fat that stacks up really nicely and is solid at room temperature. So this gentleman, William Proctor, and his brother-in-law, James Gamble, were candle makers at the turn of the last century. But at that time, being a candle maker wasn't so good because the electric light bulb had been invented. So their business was not looking so great, and they needed to pivot their business. So they knew about the invention of these trans fats, this like solid fat. And of course, being candle makers, they were experts in fats because wax is a fat. And they were like, what can we do with this solid fat stuff? How can we market it? And they had the genius idea that they would get people to eat it. And that's where Crisco comes from. So people loved Crisco, right? Crisco makes the cake 1 inch higher. Food manufacturers loved Crisco. If you ate Oreo cookies prior to 2003, that center of the Oreo cookie was made from trans fat. I remember my grandmother like telling me about this and being like, oh, don't eat the centers. Anyways, today trans fat is largely no longer an issue. It's been pretty much eradicated from the food supply, but there's like an asterisk there, and I'll tell you that in a moment. It's probably one of the great public health nutrition triumphs of like the last few decades, but they technically do still exist in the food supply, and only because of the loopholes in food labeling laws. So if you look at a nutrition facts table, every nutrition facts table has to report trans fat, but they can report 0 grams of trans fat if there is less than 0.5 grams per serving. So the idea is, maybe you're eating 1 serving, maybe you're eating 5 servings of that food, and if you're eating 5 servings, maybe you are getting some trans fat, but it's very small amounts, and I don't think that's really a big issue. That's kind of more just a fun fact about how, food labeling is this atrocious thing. But the other thing to keep in mind is that, I'm picking on Oreo cookies. It's not just Oreo cookies, but it's not just the trans fat that's the problem when we eat things like cookies. We know that also high glycemic index carbs and sugar also increase LDL cholesterol. So again, it's a bit of a paradigm shift because we've always thought like fat leads to cholesterol, but we know that this other stuff can be quite problematic as well. I'm not going to get into too much of the details about particle size and all that. This is like a fascinating area that there just isn't enough time for today, but I do want to highlight that carbs and sugar play a role in this process as well. All right, so we have talked about the foods that increase LDL cholesterol. But again, it's not just about telling patients what they shouldn't eat. What we really want to do is tell them what they should eat. So the other side of the coin is the foods that decrease cholesterol. So let's walk through those. To explain this and to put us all in the same frame of mind, let's talk about the benchmarks just to remind everybody for cholesterol. So basically, we say that less than 100 milligrams per deciliter is optimal, 100 to 160 is elevated, and 160 is high, right? Now, if you ask some people, they'll tell you, actually, ideal is 50 to 70. That's a debatable thing. We don't have to get into it. But these are the benchmarks we're thinking about. And the average cholesterol, LDL cholesterol level in American adults is 116 milligrams per deciliter. So for the next few slides, I'm going to use 116 as the benchmark that I'm doing my calculations based off of, just so you guys understand, because obviously percent reductions are relative to where you're starting. So the first food that I want to talk about that decreases cholesterol is nuts. So this is a meta-analysis of 61 randomized controlled trials. Okay, this is not like one little study out there. 61 randomized controlled trials show that on average, if you eat one handful of nuts or about a quarter of a cup, it will decrease your LDL cholesterol by 5 milligrams per deciliter, or about 4%. So that's kind of a modest amount, right? But it's also something, and it's not that hard to eat a handful of nuts per day. But what's interesting is if you look at the dose response meta-analysis. So you take all those studies, plot them. Along the x-axis, you have the number of grams of nuts per day, and then you have your cholesterol reduction. What you can see is that as you increase your nut consumption, your cholesterol levels tend to go down. And in fact, if you eat 100 grams or 1 cup of almonds per day, you decrease LDL cholesterol by 33 milligrams per deciliter, or 30%. That's pretty impressive if you consider that rosuvastatin had a dose of 10 milligrams, decreases LDL by about 45%. So I think that's pretty good. But then, of course, you have to ask yourself, well, I mean, 1 cup of almonds, that kind of feels like a lot. This is 1 cup of almonds on a plate. I think depending on the person, it's achievable. If you're like me, I also counted it out. It's 166 almonds, which looks like this. The other question is always like, is this like economically feasible? Nuts are expensive. So I kind of went shopping around Norfolk to price almonds in different stores and to get a price comparison on how much food costs for reducing cholesterol versus medications. So basically, if you want to eat 1 cup of almonds every day to reduce your cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol, it will cost you about $40 to $72 per month. This is based on like Aldi and Harris Teeter and Food Lion. Aldi had the cheapest price, Harris Teeter had the most expensive price, Food Lion was somewhere in the middle. But if you compare that to the prices I got from GoodRx, your statin is going to cost you $54 to $146 per month. So interestingly, almonds are a cheaper way to lower your LDL cholesterol compared to rosuvastatin, although you probably can't claim the almonds on your insurance. So that's a problem. How do nuts actually lower cholesterol? This is interesting too. So part of the reason nuts lower cholesterol is because they contain MUFA fats, which we've already talked about as being, oh, I didn't animate that. MUFA fats, so technically almonds and nuts can also be in that group. I didn't include them initially. The other thing is they contain these things called phytosterols or plant sterols. So phytosterols are plant-derived compounds that look a lot like cholesterol. As you can see here, this is the phytosterol, that's the cholesterol. They look the same, right? And then the body also can't detect the difference between them, and they compete for absorption, and they decrease your absorption of cholesterol. Because keep in mind, every day your cholesterol is getting processed through your liver. It's sliding down what I like to call the bile duct slide into the intestines, and you want to excrete that cholesterol. But if there's opportunities for it to be reabsorbed, it gets reabsorbed, but having more of these things around prevent that from happening and prevent it to be on its way out of the body. This is for the question that we had earlier. So the other way that nuts lower cholesterol is because they contain what's called soluble fiber. So let's talk about now the dietary fiber family tree. So there are 2 main types of dietary fiber. There is insoluble fiber, which is characterized by the fact that it does not dissolve in water. And then there is soluble fiber, which dissolves in water. And we know that, as we talked about before, the soluble fibers, you eat them, they dissolve in the water in your intestines, they form that gel. That gel traps things like sugar. It also traps things like cholesterol. But, so you get your insoluble fiber. There's different types, like cellulose, which you get from fruits and vegetables, hemicellulose, which you get from like nuts and legumes, lignans, which you can get from tree bark. But then there's these soluble fibers, right? And they're the ones that form the gels, and they're the ones that trap sugars and trap cholesterol. There's many different types of soluble fibers, but a few of the ones I'm going to be talking about are beta-glucans and pectins and psyllium. You'll hear more about these in a moment. So psyllium fiber, this is a meta-analysis, 28 randomized controlled trials, showed that if you eat 2 teaspoons of psyllium fiber per day, you decrease your LDL by 13. That's a 11% reduction. Oats are a dietary source of beta-glucans. So beta-glucans are a type of soluble fiber. This is a meta-analysis of 58 trials, and they showed that if you eat 1 cup of oats per day, you can lower LDL cholesterol by 7, which is about a 6% reduction. Barley, another very rich source of beta-glucans. This is actually just based off 1 trial. Barley hasn't gotten the research that it deserves, but 3/4 of a cup of barley decreases LDL cholesterol by about 17 milligrams per deciliter and by about 15% in total. Beans, legumes, pulses, whatever you want to call them. Meta-analysis, 26 randomized controlled trials showed that you decrease LDL cholesterol by 7 milligrams per deciliter, which is about 6%. And then flax seeds, our friends from our hypertension talk, 4 tablespoons per day decreases LDL by 3 or about 2.5%. So not a huge amount, but by the way, meta-analysis, 28 controlled trials, so lots of data. Even though flax seeds alone don't have a huge effect, this is a study that really caught my attention because this is a study where they compared prescribing someone a statin alone versus prescribing them a statin and flax seeds. And what they showed is that when you added flax seeds to your prescription, their LDL went down by an additional 11.5% compared to statins alone. So once again, it's not a question of diet or drugs. It's a question of like using these things together for the best possible benefit. This is very interesting. So this is a Cochrane review looking at fruit and vegetable consumption and effects on LDL cholesterol. And what they showed is that if you eat 5 to 9 servings of fruits and vegetables per day, it really doesn't do much for your cholesterol. And I like to show this because I find that even I myself get caught in the trap of making like generic nutrition recommendations to patients, like eat more fruits and vegetables, which is always the right thing to say, unless you're specifically having a conversation about cholesterol, in which case telling people to eat more fruits and vegetables per day actually doesn't move the needle at all. It will decrease their risk for all-cause mortality, though, so you're not doing them any harm. That being said, we talked before about the different fibers. Apples are very high in pectin, which is a soluble fiber, and research shows 1 randomized controlled trial, but still 2 apples per day decrease LDL cholesterol by 7, which is about 6%. So, and that's because they contain pectin. So there's a lot of foods that you can add to the diet to lower LDL. Here they are all stacked up. Barley, it was only 1 trial, so again, not as robust data. Barley tops it off with a 15% reduction. Your Metamucil, your beans, oats, apples, nuts, and flax seeds. But the thing I want to impress upon you is for these foods, the only thing we're doing is adding this food to the diet, right? We're not doing anything else. We're not telling them to take anything else out. We're not telling them to change their diet. We're just telling them to add something. But what if we did change something? Later. What if we did change something? What if we swapped foods? What if we swapped olive oil for butter? What if we swapped soy burgers for beef burgers? Then how do cholesterol levels change? This is a study where they did that. They swapped 3 tablespoons of butter per day for olive oil. And by making this swap, they decreased LDL cholesterol by 15, which is a 12% reduction. And this is a study where they had people eating a lot of animal protein and soy protein, 47 grams per day, where they showed that if you swap your animal protein for soy protein, you decrease LDL by 22 milligrams per day, which is a 19% reduction. But again, I just want to point out, it was a good amount. So like they were then eating about a soy protein patty, a cup of tofu, and soy milk every day. So like high amounts of these soy products. So obviously, there's a lot of individual things that you can do to lower cholesterol. But the question is, could these effects be additive? What if you did all of these things? Would you get a maximal reduction? Would it all add up and you would bring it down by, a huge amount? There's actually a study that tested this. So there is this diet, it's called the portfolio diet. And the portfolio diet is all about giving people a portfolio of foods to lower their cholesterol. Once again, it was invented at the University of Toronto. This is me with the inventor of the portfolio diet. It was invented at St. Michael's Hospital, which is the hospital where I did my clerkship, shown right here. And the portfolio diet basically looks like this. They're eating 45 grams of nuts per day. That's about a handful to 2 handfuls. Plant protein, biscuits or sticky fiber, which is those soluble fibers. And they're eating plant sterols every day. And this was a study published in JAMA in 2011. And what they showed is that the control is like the top line. The portfolio diet reduced cholesterol as much as, at that time they used pravastatin was like the going drug. So it reduced cholesterol as much as pravastatin. So that's pretty impressive because it shows that if you put all these foods together, the effects are additive. They're not gonna you're not gonna max out, like if you have the apple and the oats, like it tops out. No, it doesn't. They add and your cholesterol gets lower and lower. And if you're interested in hard outcomes, the Women's Health Initiative showed that if you eat the portfolio diet, it does decrease risk for coronary events. So it's not just a cholesterol lowering effect. We're not just changing the marker of disease, we are changing the actual disease outcome itself. So what do we tell our patients? This is another guide that I made after I arrived here, giving people very simple things that they can do to lower their cholesterol levels. So it's individual actions. Again, you could pick one and say, which one of these things do you think you could add to your diet? Or which one of these things do you think you could change? I'm still working on this. I think I'm going to like reinvent it. But for now, this is one that I've been using that you can use too if you're interested. So let's recap what we talked about for nutrition and cholesterol. So we talked about the foods that raise LDL cholesterol, saturated fat, trans fats, high GI foods, and sugar. We also talked about the foods that lower LDL cholesterol, barley, beans, psyllium fiber, nuts, oats, and apples. We mentioned the portfolio diet, which puts all of these foods together for a maximal cholesterol lowering effect. And finally, we talked about how 1 cup of almonds is roughly equivalent to low-dose statins, which I think is pretty impressive if you can swallow those 166 almonds per day. So people always ask me, you know, what's the secret to healthy eating? And the thing is, there is no secret. In 500 BC, Plato spoke about nutrition. And he basically said, I'm not even making this up, healthy diet consists of barley, wheat, legumes, fruit, fish, and olive oil. And treats to be consumed are meats, confectionaries, and wine. So basically, a lot of the stuff we talked about today, based on hundreds of years, not even hundreds, like 100 years of research, and a lot of man hours of time in the lab, in 500 BC, it had all been said and done, and nothing's really changed, right? Like, I devoted my life to this, and I'm like, well, I mean, I can only conclude what was concluded 500 years ago. So it is actually really simple, and it's not as confusing as we make it out to be. So that's something to keep in mind. I like to talk about very briefly my nutrition philosophy, just so people kind of understand like where I come from when I think about these things. I think the most important principle of nutrition is balance. And to me, balance looks like this. When you sit down, you want to fill about half of your plate with vegetables, a quarter with carbs, and a quarter with protein. I didn't invent this. It basically looks the same as the food guide that we currently have. So another good thing that you can do with patients is just give them a copy of the food guide and be like, this is what I want your plate to look like. I will say, I've been struggling to get copies, like printed colorful copies of this. Back home, I could get them to send me like as many copies as I wanted in like every language imaginable. I'm still trying to find that here, but this is a nice tool that we can use with our patients. The second principle is knowing yourself. Every human being is unique. Everyone's ideal diet is different, right? What's going to be right for you is not what's going to be right for someone else. Every patient that you have is going to need something that's unique. And the other thing too is what works for you today might not work for you 5 years from now or 10 years from now. It's kind of, you're an ever evolving creature with ever evolving needs. So keep that in mind that there is no one size fits all approach when it comes to nutrition. The next rule is nothing in excess, maybe except olive oil, but even that, obviously, right? We can't overdo anything. That just is a universal principle. I think structure is really important. I think having a framework, eating a certain number of meals per day, eating them at certain times, as we learned, really helps. I have this concept called respecting your taste buds. And the idea is if you eat something like really, really sweet for breakfast, you're never going to be able to appreciate the taste of those almonds, right? They're going to taste horrible. Whereas if you eat almonds and you're actually hungry, they actually taste pretty good. So you don't want to like, you know, have your food intensity flavor climax too early in the day. You want to kind of work your way up to those more intense flavors because then you can't appreciate the more subtle ones. And finally, make treats, right? There's nothing wrong with treats. We should all treat ourselves sometimes, but by definition, they should be treats and not things that we do constantly or all the time. So we talked about a lot of things. We covered a lot of territory. Let's just quickly recap what we did. So we talked about flax seeds first, how they're rich in omega-3 fatty acids. We talked about how those omega-3 fatty acids are part of this dietary fat family tree. The balance between omega-6s and 3s was disturbed when the continuous press was invented, because then omega-6s entered our food supply in unprecedented numbers, entered our cells, disrupted the balance, but we need to eat more ground flaxseed in order to correct that. We talked about salt, the salt sensitivity phenomenon, how potassium can eliminate that salt sensitivity phenomenon, how potassium is found in these sorts of foods, how the DASH diet is good, and plant-based diets are potentially even more effective for lowering blood pressure. We talked about diabetes, how just the 1992 food guide can prevent it, how low-carb diets can reverse it, and how weight loss can also reverse it. And then my favorite part, how to mitigate the effects of carbohydrates. We talked about the what factor, the glycemic index, and how it can be almost as effective as metformin for people with uncontrolled diabetes. We talked about who the carbs are being eaten with, how eating carbs with protein, with fat, that includes cheese and potentially butter, can actually lower the glycemic response. We talked about how the foods are being eaten, how eating, a salad with fat and vinegar before you eat your meal can mitigate carbohydrate responses. We also, most importantly, talked about the order in which foods are eaten. The worst way to eat your meal is to have carbs first. The best way to eat your food is to have carbs at the end of the meal. And finally, we talked about the when, right? The fact that all of our hormones follow a circadian rhythm. Carbs eaten earlier in the day do not spike your blood sugar as much as carbs eaten later in the day. And finally, the value of time-restricted eating and the fact that in diabetics, time-restricted eating might actually be more effective than metformin. Finally, we talked about cholesterol, all the dietary sources of saturated fat, the controversy that exists with whether that change in LDL actually leads to a change in events, which a lot of research suggests that it does. We talked about my favorite fats, the MUFA fats, trans fats, and all the woes of trans fats. And then we flipped the lid, right? We said it's not just what you don't eat that matters, it's what you're not eating that you need to eat. So the foods that lower cholesterol, once again, are barley, psyllium fiber, beans, oats, apples, nuts, flax seeds, replacing olive oil instead of butter, replacing soy proteins instead of animal proteins. Portfolio Diet does all of this together and proved that it is as effective as statins. We talked about how a cup of almonds can be almost as effective as rosuvastatin. Then finally, we ended with the idea that all of this has been said and done in 500 BC and nothing has changed. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's just about balance. So this is my website. Feel free to grab guides from there all the time. It has been such a pleasure sharing this with you guys. Thank you for being a good audience. I'm happy to entertain questions. I'm sure there'll be a lot. That's why I booked this for a long time, because I figured there would be questions. So why don't we answer questions at this point? Yeah, go ahead.
Are there other natural sources of psyllium that you know?
That's a great question. Okay, so this Metamucil comes from psyllium husk. And I understand that at like certain stores, you can buy psyllium husk. I don't know where to get it around here, but I'm pretty sure like health food stores would sell psyllium husk. Outside of that, I don't know of like individual foods that would contain it. I think it's just like its own unique grain. So you'd have to buy the husk itself. Yeah.
Were there any like part of the studies you used? There's a study about like oleic acid or omega-9 in like vanilla oil.
That's a good point. You know what? I don't spend a lot of time thinking about omega-9. I always get puzzled by like the supplements that are like 369 supplements. First of all, because why would anyone want to take 6? And I've actually never seen a solely omega-9. And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't even know like what the exact dietary source of omega-9 is, or is it something that we create like through the metabolism of, because I know the omega-3s, they all get change, like the saturations change and such and that in the body. So I don't know a lot about omega-9. Do you know something about it?
It's supposed to generate some certain flours, like for Canadian oil, canola.
Oh, okay, canola. Okay, so canola is very interesting. So canola oil is actually, canola stands for Canadian oil. It's made from rape seeds because no one wants to call it rapeseed oil. And canola oil is, of all the vegetable oils, canola oil has the most favorable omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. What's also happened over the years is they have not genetically modified, but like selected for varieties of rapeseed that have a more favorable profile. So they actually do have a little bit more omega-3s than your like cottonseed oil and your corn oil and safflower oil. So it's a little bit better, but it's still not good. It's hard for me to, I shouldn't be saying that. Should be promoting this Canadian crop, but it's still not like, I would still take the olive oil over canola oil any day. And if you had to choose between canola versus sunflower, safflower, et cetera, then you would pick your canola oil. But I don't think canola oil has 9 to my knowledge. Maybe I'm wrong. Oleic? Oh, I thought, high oleic acid. Oh yeah, what is oleic? Is it a 9? It probably is. Okay, yeah, because there is high oleic acids. Yeah. I don't know where it fits. Now I got to look into that. Okay, I'll be back to you with that. Any other questions? And feel free to like come up to me anytime, ask me anything. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on cooking?
I love this question. Okay, so there's a lot of talk out there about how like olive oil has this low smoke point and you shouldn't cook with it. But if you go to Greece, like everybody makes French fries in olive oil, and that's just how it is. I cook with olive oil all the time. You're going to lose some of the health benefits because you know how I talked about how olive oil is a fruit oil. So part of what you're getting is the fruit's nutrients that are still in that actual fat. when you cook, you might degrade some of those compounds. So what I do, here's my scenario. I have the olive oil that my father sent me with, which is like direct from Greece. And I have that one and I'm only using it like for my salads and stuff. And then the one that I bought here, I'm using when I cook. Because I figure, you know, I'm not worried about putting that loofah low smoke point oil. I'm not worried about heating it, but I don't want to waste those extra nutrients if I'm going to destroy some of them. So I think you're fine cooking with it. But if you're going to invest in that really high quality oil and you don't want to only invest, maybe you have like a 2-tier system like me, then like you use your good quality oil in the non-heated scenarios. But that's something that comes up all the time, is this notion. People are like, you can't cook with it. But I'm like, I'm pretty sure people have cooked with it for like thousands of years. So like we're all good.
One of the slides was replacing like a burger with a soy burger. What's your opinion on the Beyond Meat burger?
Yeah, it's a good question. The thing is, it depends on what you're worried about, right? If you're someone who like has high cholesterol and your biggest concern is not consuming that animal protein and having that increase in LDL cholesterol, then the Beyond Meat burger might be better. But if you look at it in like a global picture, the Beyond Meat burger definitely has more dietary sodium. We were talking about that earlier. And then the other question is, can a processed food ever be healthier than like the food that nature created? And sometimes I lean towards like just trying to eat as much real food as possible. And all of these like creations that we theoretically want to be better, I'm not sure if in the long term we're going to find out why they're not better. It's kind of like it's kind of like what's happened with the omega-6s. Like people think that's better, and we're still replacing saturated fat with omega-6s en masse, but we're probably going to find out that actually that's not the best way. And going like with the more natural approach, in my experience, usually ends up being the way to go. But again, it's a question of balance. Like if it's here and there, who cares? Like choose whatever you want. If it's your dietary staple, then you got to be more cautious about it.
So with the food coma that when you eat and then fall asleep, besides reducing your intake, are there things that you can do to limit that? And is the pathology of that just simply blood rushes to your intestines and helping you digest?
Partially that. It's also insulin, because I think what's basically happening is like you take in all this food, you get this spike of insulin. Insulin makes your body suck up all that sugar immediately, and then you're done. And what you see is when I showed you those glycemic index curves, and I showed like the red line going up and then coming down, what I didn't show you is it actually happens when you eat high glycemic index carbs or large amounts of carbs, is you don't go up and come down. You go up and you go lower than your baseline. And that's the carb coma. So to answer your question about things you can do to prevent that, all of those who, what, where, that stuff, all of that's going to help. The other thing you could do to mitigate that a little bit is to exercise before. Because if you exercise before, your muscles actually send more transporters for glucose to their surfaces, and then they're going to suck up more of that sugar naturally without the insulin having to do it. So that also helps. But I would say like if you're feeling those carb comas, it kind of tells you that like maybe what you're like, it's just not ideal, like what you've done. And like we all do that sometimes, right? We're all going to find ourselves in that situation where we've eaten something that maybe we shouldn't have. But if it's happening on a regular basis, then maybe you want to rejig things. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
just kind of a more flattened sort of.
Exactly. Exactly, because then you're not going to get the part where you go lower than your baseline. Yeah.
I find that a shot of espresso like Italian after that works great.
Yeah, it works too. Yeah, that is a fair antidote. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. On the topic of front loading your carb consumption, like I know for a lot of us, like we, at least from what I surveyed, a lot of us like to work out and things at the evening time, and therefore would probably require carb loading near the end of the day. So, I mean, I heard what you said just now about the exercising before you work out and everything, but as far as like just diet alone in the context of working out in the evenings, what are some recommendations?
That's a great question. I'm going to preface it by saying this is like a deep literature. There's like a huge literature on this, right? Like how to exercise and balance and all this perfectly. I'm not the best expert in this, but I'll give you like my sense of it. This is tricky. I would say if you don't have any issues, you don't necessarily have to change what you're doing. So if what you've got works for you, don't mess with it. But if you're like, oh, I feel like I don't have the energy I need, or I feel like I'm not meeting the like fitness goals that I want, there is a huge debate on like eating before exercise versus exercising on the empty stomach. It's a huge thing that's hotly debated. And I don't know if there actually is a right or wrong way to do it, to be perfectly honest with you. It also depends on what your goal is with exercise. Is your goal with exercise muscle mass, or is your goal weight loss, or a little bit of both? That would also change things. So I don't have a perfect answer. I think it comes back to that principle of knowing yourself and experimentation, and then just seeing what can work for you. But what I would say is what you don't want to do is you don't want to like go to work, go to the gym, come home and eat your biggest meal of the day. That is always going to be metabolically problematic. But if you go to work and then go to the gym at the end of the day, you probably do need something after. And even if you're outside that window and it's like past 6 o'clock, I think like if you're exercising, that's probably fair.
Yeah, I was just thinking, because at least for me, let me just go ahead and offer myself as a sacrifice. But so go to work, exercise in the evenings, and obviously I'm hungriest.
Yeah.
In the day after that workout. And then I come work and closes, I finish up with it by the time I'm done with the gym and everything, like 8 p.m.-ish. So very hungry. It's
Totally.
already past the 6 p.m. window. So that's why I just
No.
what was driving my curiosity.
No, absolutely. And it's a great question. And like things you could do is like front loading your day still helps, because then you're going to make that meal that you do eat smaller. And that's what I would say would be the strategy. And the whole thing is people often say like, well, I can't eat a big breakfast. But if you just kind of like skip that dinner-ish, like post-workout snack one night, you'll wake up hungrier, and then you'll want to have that bigger dinner, and then you'll flip your intake. But it's tricky. I mean, our schedules are difficult to work around, and as are our patients. Like to tell someone don't eat anything past 6 o'clock. Well, what if they do shift work? It's not a perfect science. And that's the part of what I like about nutrition is it's not the one size fits all. It's not a prescription. It's like you have to really work with each person individually to figure out how to make it work for them.
Spanish method kind of work though. They have their biggest meal like midday, and they get a siesta, we don't. But and then they have a smaller meal at the end.
Yeah. I think that probably culturally works better too. Because like who has time to eat a really, you know what I mean? The breakfast like a king is a bit of the extreme of it. I think that's probably the way to go. Like have your breakfast and then make your middle meal your meal of the day, and then your small dinner. No, totally.
Back to your, I can't remember the study, but the almonds that help bring down your cholesterol. Did it mention anything about almond milk?
That is a great question. Okay, so the studies haven't tested almond milk specifically, but, and again, so I always say like the real food is always better than the processed version, but the almond milk is probably still pretty good. It probably has a small effect. I can't quantify exactly what that is for you, but it definitely would be something between nothing and some effect. That's what I would say.
I think almond milk, they say it's the whole container that you get, it's only like half a cup. It's mostly water. So it's not like
Yeah, so you're probably not going to get.
lots of water. I would get the barista version. You ever seen the barista version? It's like the thicker down almond milk that you use for coffee. I might not taste as good by itself.
All right. Yeah.
Also, kind of back to the carbohydrate thing. I think it's like very interesting in terms of like eating like a protein or fat prior to eating the carbohydrates, but typically most people are gonna like combine their foods and eat it all together. So if you're like recommending that, like, is there like a certain amount of time, like if you are going to eat the fat or the protein first, is there like a certain amount of time that you should wait after like you eat the fat, and then like should you wait before you eat the carbohydrate? Does that have the same effect on the?
Yeah, great question. In that study that I showed you, they weren't actually waiting. It was literally just the order in which it was being put into the stomach. So there are studies where they do that, where they like eat the first course and then they wait 20 minutes. And the waiting can help, but in those studies, they still got big reductions without waiting. So it's still like, again, culturally feasible to do. It's not like everyone has to be like, okay, now we need to spend 2 hours eating because we got to put these breaks in between. There was also one study, which I haven't made into a slide yet, where they looked at the speed at which you ate the carbs. And if you eat the carbs faster, does it spike your blood sugar more than if you eat the carbs slower? And it interestingly didn't make a difference. I have to read it in greater detail, but the speed thing doesn't seem to make a big effect. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you all so much for listening. It's been fun. So you glad you came?
Yeah.
I told you guys that.
No, it was really cool.
No, that was really good.
You're welcome.
Like some of the things I kind of love in lessons.
You're,
Yeah, I know.
That's the joke, is like, in presentation, so she's like the doctor, but it's also like, well, we're all human and we all eat, so. It's like, I mean,
I was supposed to.
Appreciate the talk.
you're welcome, you're welcome.
This is unrealistic.
I love it. Yeah, to some degree, to some degree.
What are your thoughts on the animal stuff?
Okay.
It's like a spin-off of the carnivore.
I was, yeah, I was gonna have a slide about this, and then it just got too long and I had to take it
It's
out.
like super popular.
So wait, just give me your take. So is it is it like carnivore basically?
So it's like a spin-off. So it's basically
Meat and vegetables.
primarily red meat, avoiding all vegetables. A lot of fruit, raw dairy, raw honey, and
Okay, so I think the first question is always like, what are you trying to get out of it, right? Like, what is the goal? I was having this conversation like with my Uber driver recently because he was like on this side and he's like, how long for all this weight? So if someone is overweight and they want to lose weight, any way that they can lose weight is just getting out of the weight. And or if this, even if this isn't a calorie deficit,